Alright, so welcome back to Broken Spoke, Cycle, and Speed. Today we'll be working on installing our crankshaft. So first off, what we need to do is install our bearings to check for our bearing clearance, and then we will check for our crankshaft end play.
First thing we have to do is put the bearing shells in the block. So just put a little bit of light oil just in the bottom side of the block. Then you're going to take the bearing shells and place them in. There's a little tab on the bearing shell and a little notch in the block, and you want to make sure that you line those up. Make sure that the shell is setting flush with the top edges of the block. You'll see the little slot in the bearing shell. Make sure that that goes over the oil holes in your block. If you have oil holes and no slot in the bearing, that means you've got the wrong side of the bearing shell. So you want to make sure that you put the right side of the bearing shell in the right portion, whether it's in the cap or in the block. Then you're going to gently place the crank in place, and notice there's no oil or grease, assembly lube or anything on the crank at this point. All we're doing is measuring clearance for the bearing. So it's actually very important that there is no oil or grease on the bearing shell itself or on the journal. And the reason for that is we're going to use plastic gauge to measure the clearance between the crank itself and the bearing. And plastic gauge is oil soluble, so if you have oil or grease or anything on there, you're going to get a false reading whenever you go and pull the caps off. And plastic gauge is essentially just a wax. It's a preset thickness. For this particular measurement, we're using the red plastic gauge, which is, I believe, the smallest. You're just going to cut a little strip of it, place it on the crank underneath the bearing cap, and then we'll place all the bearing caps in place, torque them to spec, and then pull them all back off again and see how much squish, essentially a real technical term, but how much squish the plastic gauge has moved. Essentially it's designed to flatten at a given rate, and so after we've applied all the torque to all the bearing caps, we'll take these all off and we'll check and compare that squish to the gauge that comes with the plastic gauge. For this particular block, we're going to do a two-step torquing sequence. The maximum torque on the bearing caps for this particular block spec is 60 pounds. So we're going to do a two-step. We'll do the first step up to 40 and then the second step up to 60. There isn't really a tightening specification or order that we could find for a 302. It's just always been my experience that it's usually best to start at the middle and work your way out, just like heads, intake manifolds, all that stuff. So you'll see us work from the center out, alternating back and forth, again doing that two-step torque sequence, first to 60 pounds, or excuse me, again, first to 40 pounds and then back up to 60 pounds. They all got torqued up to spec, so now we get to break them all loose. It's kind of a tedious, repetitive process here, checking your specs, but it's time well spent versus trusting and thinking that everything was going to be okay. Now, in this particular case, we were pretty sure our bearing clearance was going to be good. This crank was only lightly polished. It was in really, really good shape, especially for its age. So we didn't have to have it turned down. So just a light polish. The machinist got it really, really cleaned up for us, and we're using standard bearings. There was no need to go to an oversized bearing. But we'll break all these bolts loose, get them all pulled out, take the caps back off, and then take a look at what the plastic gauge is telling us for our clearance. So you can see the pink there on the crank. That's the plastic gauge, and it's squished out. That's the gauge that comes with it. Essentially, it's the package. You're going to compare the squish to what it shows on the package to see what your clearance is. For us, it ended up being, I believe it was 0.00156, right around there. It was right exactly in the desired range. Now we're going to check our thrust bearing, essentially the in play for the crank. What we didn't show in the video is actually reinstalled the crank, put the bearing caps back on, re-torqued everything again in a two-step process, first 40 pounds, then 60 pounds, and then used a block of wood, tapped the crank back as far as it would go, and then checked the clearance there between the thrust bearing, which is in our case on the center bearing cap, and the edge of the crank, and then do it again. We use that pry bar as you saw to slide the crank forward, and we'll check the clearance between the bearing cap and the crank, or excuse me, the thrust bearing edge and the crank. For us, the tolerance was as much as 8 thousandths. So we went through the process on the back side of the thrust bearing, and our clearance was 6 thousandths. And you can just see that there we are. We're at 6 thousandths was the feeler gauge that worked best for that one as well. So 6 thousandths clearance. So then we remove the crank again, and now we're getting ready to install it for real. So part of that means having to put the rear main seal in. In our case, we're using a two-piece rear main seal. You saw in the video there just cleaning that off. We just use lacquer thinner. You can use any sort of wax and grease remover. You just want to make sure that the mating surfaces are very, very clean, and then use some compressed air to make sure that they are also dry. And then you're going to apply just a very thin bead of RTV sealant on both sides of the rear main seal. If you don't do this, it's a guarantee your rear main seal is going to leak, especially with a two-piece. So in our particular application, the instructions called for a 1/16 of an inch bead. Typically, I've found that it's whenever you put a bead on, when you tighten down your bearing cap, it just kind of squishes all over the place and has a tendency to get places it doesn't need to be. And because the tolerance in this assembly is so tight anyway, you're usually best to just apply a real thin bead along the edge, and then just use some sort of spreader and kind of smooth it out. I like these silicone spreaders. These I purchased through Rockler. You can get them online, or a Rockler retailer. I'm sure you could probably get them at some of the home improvement stores as well. The nice thing about the silicone spreaders is the RTV doesn't stick to it, so you can clean them off after you're done. Again, you'll see just a real thin bead is all it takes. And this just really, it helps to ensure that your rear main seal isn't going to leak. Now with the two-piece, with ours in particular, it calls for a 3/8 inch offset. So you'll see we've got a depth gauge here that we've set for 3/8 of an inch. And we'll place the rear main seal in the groove, and then check with the depth gauge to make sure that we get that end of the main seal sticking up 3/8 of an inch. The reason behind that is that if you aligned your rear main seal flush with the deck surface of the block and the main cap, it's going to guarantee that it's going to leak, because it's going to put that seam right at the same seam as everything else. So by offsetting it at 3/8 of an inch, you're going to have half of your joint up in the bearing cap and the other half of the joint down in the block, where there's less of a chance for it to leak. So that, in combination with the bead of RTV, is really going to give us the best chance of not having any leak in our rear main seal. The other thing to pay attention to with your particular rear main seal is which direction goes in towards the engine, which side goes out towards the air. Ours had a little picture on it, shows you which side goes inside, which goes to the outside. Make sure you get it in the right way. Now you can see we're putting a liberal amount of assembly lube on the bearing shells. We've done the same thing on the crank journals and on the bearing caps. This engine's going to sit for a little while before it's put back in the vehicle, so we want to make sure that we got a really, really good coat of assembly lube on everything. This is going to give us the best protection on startup. We will obviously prime the oil pump, get oil pumped through everything before we fire the engine, but we want to make sure that we've got a good coat of assembly lube on all those bearing surfaces. You'll also see here that we're oiling the threads on all of the bearing cap bolts to make sure that we get proper torque and that they go in nice and smooth. Another thing that isn't shown on the video, when we got this crank and parts back from the machinist, we blew compressed air through all of the oil passages, made sure everything was clean. We ran a chasing tap through all of the holes, all the threads, make sure everything was good to go. Now see here, we just snugged down the bolts and we made sure to rotate the crank. You want to make sure that as you go through all of these processes, you're checking that crank rotation through all of them. If it is binding or doesn't want to move or whatever, you know you've got a problem. Stop then so you don't wreck anything. We just took it up to 40 pounds. Now we're taking it up for that last pass at 60 pounds. And again, through each one of these steps, after each one, we're going to turn that crank and make sure everything feels right. This felt really good. No binding. Everything looked good. No RTV any place it shouldn't be. Just running through one last time, double checking that torque spec at 60 pounds so that everything was good to go.
Alright, so we got the crank installed today. We checked our bearing clearance and it was right around 0.0015, which is right around the desired area. Everything's spinning right, it's not binding, and everything was right in spec where we wanted it to be.